just wanted to welcome all of you once again. And thank you so much for taking the time to join this conversation. It's the first of what I hope are many offline conversations that we've had. And now, hopefully we can have it with a wider audience. So Terra Conscious Conversations is not really limited to tourism. It is something I'm starting with marine and coastal tourism because today is World Oceans Day, 8th June, and it's a global effort to sort of keep the spotlight on the oceans for a little while. I always, sort of joke that it's like the Met Gala for marine people. Because, on this day, everybody's interested. All the newspapers will write to you. Multiple articles saying, oh, please say something about why oceans are important. But, obviously that's a conversation that we have to have beyond World Oceans Day. So that's why we started this. And I'd like to welcome Joanna and to Charmaine and to Pooja for taking the time, and to just say that Poonam Rebo from Konkan Explorers was also supposed to join us today, but unfortunately she's had an all-day power shutdown and has lost inverter backup as well. So she'll hopefully join us on another conversation later in the month. So now I'm just going to request Joanna to kick off the introduction circle, and and she knows all about circles, but I'm going to tell you why.
Thank you, Pooja, and thank you for inviting me to participate. So my name is Joanna Pyres. I'm an Anglo-Goan. I was born in the UK, but I'm half Goan and I come back here. My specialization is in multi-stakeholder collaboration for sustainable development. I feel very passionately about that, both at a global level and in Goa. And I think today you've picked this subject of resilience, and there's such an example of a subject that really requires multi-stakeholders, different stakeholders to work together, because it's not something that one stakeholder can achieve alone. And I'm particularly passionate, and hence your reference to circles, about participatory practice and the way in which you can really create spaces for dialogue and collaborative action that can really break down some of the power barriers that are causing some of the issues. So really happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for being here. Charmaine, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, I was just saying hi, Sandra Sahati, and very much born and brought up out here. I think one of the reasons I started and came back home was because when I did about a couple years ago, everything that I grew up to wasn't really there anymore. And the reason why I started was so that to, kind of share my childhood with whoever else is there, whatever's left of it. And in a way, if it could be protected through that share and exchange of knowledge, or what I would say is memories and things like that, then I would be happy. Born and brought up out here. I think one of the reasons I started and came back home was because when I did about a couple years ago, everything that I grew up to wasn't really there anymore. And the reason why I started was so that to, kind of share my childhood with whoever else is there, whatever's left of it. And in a way, if it could be protected through that share and exchange of knowledge, or what I would say is memories and things like that, then I would be happy. So, yeah, happy to be here and be a part of all you guys who are doing phenomenally well in this space, and happy to share thoughts and have this dialogue with you all today.
Thank you, Charmaine. Thank you so much for being here. And Pooja, please share your story with us.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Happy Monday and happy World Oceans Day. And thank you, Pooja and Terra Conscious, for inviting me here. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation with other lovely ladies. It's a really rare opportunity to have so many ladies taking part in a conversation that's so important, and really honored to be part of it. My name is Pooja Rani, and I'm co-founder of Koj Ao Adventures here in Goa. We focus on exploring and learning about the outdoors, and so sometimes we're in the mountains, sometimes we're at the sea, but our whole premise is to be as responsible as possible, to be conscientious, and to ensure that learners and explorers of all ages have access to the great, beautiful Goan backyards, which unfortunately are slowly decreasing in size. So I'm really excited here to be part of this conversation so we can come up with ways to collaborate and think about conservation in our communities and changing in times of the crises that lay in front of us.
Yeah, Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better. Thanks so much. Because that's exactly what we are hoping to get out of these conversations, is to create some kind of active solutions that we can then collaboratively try to get done on the ground. So I'm going to get a few things out of the way for the audience. We're all known to each other from before, and we have worked in responsible tourism and community capacity building in Goa together. Therefore, it's quite clear that we all share the same values. So in that sense, you won't see, sort of differing views on what we think about in terms of responsibility, sustainability by and large. And that's not the point of this conversation. Is not really to look at what kind of tourism, rather about how are we going to build resilience in the tourism sector and in communities. And I'm picking tourism because obviously marine and coastal tourism is a big employer in Goa especially, and is growing in South Maharashtra, North Karnataka. The islands in India, Andaman, Nicobar, Lakshadweep, are all open for development. There are large-scale projects like Sagarmala. There are bids invited to develop, golf courses on the coast, resorts, and under niche tourism, and in the Federation of Industries of India has actually, in their 2025 Blue Economy vision, talked a lot about everything from whale and dolphin tourism to water sports, to island development and coastal development. So keeping that as the lens through which we are going to look at tourism and community resilience today, I'd like to kick off the conversation with the first question. And really it's for anyone who would like to start with taking it. I want to understand that this particular season that we've just had, 2019-2020, has been particularly interesting for two main reasons. The obvious one, of course, being the pandemic. But earlier in the year, we had two untimely cyclones, which caused a lot of flooding in the south. There was lots of damage to shacks that were already out. And this is something that's obviously not even let it to be a good season other than December and Jan a little bit. So, for those of us who've gone through this season, what are the key impacts you think, or the key takeaways you've had from this season?
There hasn't been much of a season, honestly, if I were to even say that. And I think if anything, we were looking forward to the summer months to make up for what was lost and to survive the rest of the year. But somehow that was also halted and brought to a stop. So yeah, I guess it's not just us, but the whole state that has taken a big hit this year at a very large level. Because Goa, as you know, is purely tourism dependent, or everyone's livelihoods are codependent on businesses that are in tourism. So it has been very difficult since it has started. So we'll have to see how that goes. I don't know how it's been for these other guys, but yeah, it wasn't much of a season
for you. Pooja, what about you? Did you feel that you were affected by any of the weather events earlier in November, December? Did you lose any days?
Yeah, I think that the weather, of course, has been so unpredictable. So, generally the weather is a little bit unpredictable. So we also have to plan for that when we plan our adventures. But when things like cyclones happen and they have a lot of kind of longer lasting impacts, it's really difficult. Another thing that we've noticed just over the past 4 or 5 years since we've been operating in Goa is that more and more with development happening in our own backyards, like in bados and villages all over. That a lot of our backyard trails that we used to go on aren't, as pristine and beautiful as they used to be. And we talked to a lot of people and they say the same things, that these hills used to be full of trees and no trash. And now what's happening is because a lot of new construction is happening, basically different like yoga places and villas, and they bring in a lot of construction workers and laborers from outside. And oftentimes these laborers aren't given proper accommodation. And so they end up having to go into the backyards and, having to find a way to use the toilet, and given basically no respect or dignity for the work they do, which is amazing work because everybody goes and stays in these villas and they come during the season time. But so through that, we've actually just been over the past 5 years, I think every time we go on a trail, it's, as the season opens, we hold our breath. We don't know if it'll be there. We don't know what will be cut down. And this is something we've been seeing over the course. So of course, the pandemic, changed our plans for summer. We do a lot of camping in the summertime. But these other changes have been going on. And because it's, there's never an assurance. We don't know what's going to happen, even though we know that this land is maybe comunidad land or protected land, because that doesn't mean a lot. And it's not upheld and, taken care of. For us, it seems like a gamble anytime that you're going to go outdoors. You never know what you're going to find.
Yeah, but you are seeing some changes over the years, as you're mentioning. So, Joe, I'd like to ask you to, also contribute before we go to the next question. You worked with the GIZ project last year, which was, looking at circular economy in tourism. And I know that climate was one of the issues that also was on the table for discussion with the stakeholders. So what's your take been in terms of seeing this season play out? How do you see some of those directions that this circular economy has, sort of had people thinking about? How important do you think it is for that to really be part of policy right now?
Thank you. I think it's a good question. Just for people who might be watching, Goa is one of 3 states been chosen for the circular economy to reach zero waste. And in Goa, it's the first state in India to have actually created their state strategy, and there were participatory consultations that were contributing to that strategy that got released in February of the year.
Joe, I think your
on the one hand
is frozen. Could you just go back a bit? Guys, can you hear her?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry. Could you just go back to Goa has been chosen?
Yes, Goa is one of 3 states in India chosen to pilot circular economy in India, and the first state in India to have created the state strategy. And the state strategy focused on and marine litter and waste as a constant theme. So what came out of those consultations was the clarity that the tourism industry that is there is obviously creating a huge amount of waste, and that waste is in itself causing problems, whether that's pollution in the nalas, whether that's sewage waste, whether that's plastic waste, and that there's obviously a huge responsibility of the tourism sector. I think there's also a question also in terms of, as was mentioned earlier, about the dependency in Goa on the tourism sector. So if you think of community well-being, so many people at the sort of bottom levels are really dependent on tourism, and therefore if we have such a huge tourism dependency, then there's a real concern. Like over the summer, I'm really worried what people are going to be doing. Like money, obviously COVID had that impact too. So I think there's, from a macroeconomic level, there's a real concern about the dependency, but then also when you look into the practices, it's an industry which we can see is mainly consuming rather than, although it produces wealth, it's a consuming industry. So really looking at the patterns of consumption within the tourism sector is really quite important.
Makes sense. Absolutely. And I think that's something I definitely also, like Pooja and Shamin, have faced the fact that, we're not going to have a summer kayaking, cycling and things like that. And I think, unfortunately, even if you are ready to take people out, it's going to be a while before people have the confidence to travel, or even if they should. And we are very mindful that we don't want to endanger any of the local villages or the places where we work or with the people we work by exposing them to something that none of us really know how it's going to turn out. Given that, I too have seen a lot of changes in how people are being able to cope, and that just I'm looking at really the mid and low income operator who has really been hoping and waiting for the December, Jan, March, and we're looking at extending into May. And that really has not happened. So for them, it is completely gone to zero, the book. There isn't even the option of diversifying for all of them, because many are migrant labor who were driving the boats and doing the trips. So my second question, and I'd like to start with Pooja in this, is that, talking about resilience, I see a lot of sort of debate around, or not debate, but sort of an evolution of the term from sustainability to responsibility. And even the Ecotourism Society of India has now renamed itself as the Responsible Tourism Society. So in your view, given that tourism itself has such a diverse demographic, there are all kinds of operators, and not everybody has access to being sustainable or responsible. We've just been discussing those challenges. What to you is responsible and sustainable tourism? Do you see them as interchangeable, or do you think there are two different ways of looking at tourism?
That's a great question. I mean, this is, I think, a debate that's been going on for a long time, and a lot of these in terms of development. You know, I think Joanna mentioned it earlier. We use this word sustainability, and it's a very powerful word, and it's a very powerful meaning. You know, talking about the economic, the social, and the environmental aspects. But if you look at tourism from what it is, people coming from one place to another, I think by definition, to make tourism sustainable is very difficult. Unless you're, offsetting, the cost of your flights to travel, et cetera, et cetera. But I think tourism being now a part of world economy and people traveling a lot, I think there are a lot of ways to make it really responsible. And unfortunately, in most places, it's not there yet. So, I mean, I think looking at responsible tourism, and, we're really cool. There's a very nice collective here called the RTC, the Responsible Tourism Collective. And it's made up of about 16 different businesses. And it's a loosely formed collective. And what we're trying to do is trying to bring more awareness to this responsible tourism. I mean, you're also, as Terra Conscious, part of it, and, put this together and know that getting people to think about responsible tourism is a very difficult challenge in itself. I mean, I think what the problem is sometimes is that often the environment's overlooked. And if the environment isn't overlooked, then the communities who live in those places are overlooked. Oh. I think that these two are like the most important key points. I think that wherever you're working, whether it's on the coast and you're talking about marine areas, whether you're talking about the forests, there are people that have been there before us. And of course, nature has been there much, much before us. And so in any way, in anything that we're doing, we're taking people out and folks to come out and explore these places. If we're not conscientious, then that place isn't going to be around for a long time. And it's also going to slowly change the way that the economy is. If the locals aren't part of it, if it's not participatory, then the locals aren't going to have any stake in it, and they're also not going to benefit from it, which is not. It's their land too. It's their land. We're coming in, and oftentimes people are coming in from outside and other places. So I think for me, in looking at responsible tourism, these are really two important aspects. I think it's actually making it equitable for everybody, whether you're driving the boat, whether you're providing the snacks, whether you're the fisherman who's showing somebody how to fish who's never been fishing. Whatever you're doing, you should be respected and treated with dignity, and that respect comes from many different angles. So I think that's something that's really important. But of course, this topic can be talked on forever, but I'll pass it along right now.
Shamin, that's very interesting what you said, Pooja. And Shamin, I wanted to hear your perspective on it, because I too have grappled with this thing of sustainability. To me, a lot of people seem to describe it as, oh, I'm not using plastic, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that. And I really feel that, that's part of it, yes. But responsibility means something completely different in terms of how you are engaging with the space and its people. Because like Pooja mentioned, we are not the first there, and we're in fact bringing others into that space. You being a local, having grown up around Holland and then based your business there, how do you see this perspective differently, since you are a person who's from there, but you're also bringing people into it? So what is the balance you strike, or how do you interpret these two terms? Sorry, no sound, Shamin. No sound, Shamin.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, continue.
Sorry. I was just saying that Pooja has sort of summarized the point very beautifully. But if I were to give focus on marine tourism and with what I am doing, and with respect to how you mentioned my location, we are already doing stuff like, some part of it is collecting trash or being sustainable about the refreshments we provide and how it is provided, where it comes. Also, my business can grow.
Shamin, voice is breaking. Shamin, sorry, your voice is breaking slightly.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now better. Sorry, could you repeat that last point?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I was saying no business can kind of survive or thrive if it does not help its community. If we are just looking at ourselves, then sooner or later we are kind of going to get stuck. So with Sahati, what we are already doing is we are involving as many villagers as possible in terms of whether we take food from them from time to time, or using local transport from ground, or even getting the kids out when it comes to sports, or introducing our customers to fishing. We try and get some of the locals out on those trips because they are more knowledgeable, and it kind of benefits that exchange and, helps them on that regard. Talking about responsibility further, as you mentioned, I think it's also a choice. You being consciously responsible about your location and your action makes a huge difference. So for me, Sahati focuses on non-motorized water sports. I don't have anything against motorized water sports, but if I had the choice to do it or to add it, Holland would not be that spot where I would pick to do it, because the space it's a very small space. If any of you have been, it's home to humpback dolphins. We get them all the way on the beach on most days. And because it's a sheltered bay, we wouldn't want the fishermen's activities to be affected with any of the motorized stuff. So one way of looking at it in terms of responsibility is to be conscious of the locals who were already there before me, or the practices that are there. And like Pooja mentioned, the nature that's already existing before my presence came on board, or before I could bring tourists out there. And it's also about being mindful in terms of numbers. I do not do big groups, and if I were to do it, I would not really pick that spot for it, kind of a thing, because there's lots of little things that you need to look at. So those are some of the things I think that come across, or rather, when you look at responsible and sustainable, they're also interchangeable and they are codependent on each other. But I think it's also conscious choice, and in what way you can do your best in terms of being responsible or sustainable. Sort of, it can be looked at it that way.
That's nice. I like the idea of responsible and sustainable being codependent. Naturally, you can't have one without the other. Joanna, just to kind of give the closing point on this theme, I like what Shami mentioned about how she looks at the place, and she decides whether this place is suitable for large groups, and she knows Holland is very ecologically sensitive, locally sensitive, so she doesn't do groups there. You, I know, have talked a lot about asset-based development and really looking at what's around us. How do you interpret that in terms of responsible and sustainable tourism?
So I think I've got a few points. So on the one hand, I'd just like to go back a step, because what Charmaine was talking about is understanding the limitations of her space. And I know that when we did do some work with the Ecotourism Society of India, when it was still called that, around Goa, one of the key recommendations was around carry capacity. So for me, I think responsible and sustainable tourism, we have to understand limits, because there are limits to communities, there are limits to ecosystems. And I think the first and foremost, and I think that's something that kind of needs to come, there needs to be a mandate for that from government. And I think that's often where it can be tricky, is like everybody sees economic growth as a perpetual growth pattern, but actually there are limits, and we need to work within that. So I think that's one piece. And that if we're not careful, we don't respect the limits either of the community, of the ecosystem, then it becomes extractive. And really what we want to be looking at is something which is regenerative. So this activity is coming, and it's a force for good, and it's creating greater, flourishing ecosystems and greater prosperity and social cohesion with people, rather than the opposite. And so I think in order to get there, I think asset-based community development, asset-based development is a great way, because what it does is it says, what have we got? And I think one of the big catastrophes in Goa is where we have a fantastic ecosystem and a fantastic cultural base, but there's a sense that we need like a casino or a snow park in Baga. Like, how is it possible that we see that a snow park is what's needed, rather than recognizing the assets that are already here, the people, the culture, the ecosystem, the wildlife? So I think starting from a perspective of what's here, and what are the limitations of what that can hold, and then using that to develop a strategy would be and that has to be done at the local level, realistically. But it can be done, and it can be a great participatory exercise.
Yeah. I completely agree with that, because I think this customer-based development approach, which is people want to go to a park, so let's have a park. People want to go to an aquarium, let's have an aquarium. The whole point of travel should be that you need to create awareness in people that there's something else to see. And I have long felt that Goa has suffered from a branding problem, where certain desires are used to, yes, people might desire to gamble, they might desire to party, but it's not necessary that that becomes the only model of tourism that's primarily supported at scale. So, this is something that I wanted to kind of touch upon when we're looking at the pandemic and impacts, and also in what we understand by sustainability and responsibility. But coming to the second half of the conversation, I thought we could talk a little bit about equity and justice. And I think it's really important, especially because of the conversations that are happening around the world right now, whether it's with the protests in US, whether it's so huge voice to, the caste issues in India, the class issues in India, and all the kind of gaps that we've all seen in the early days of the pandemic, and now needing civil society to really step in, and even that has been quite, very few possibly compared to what's needed. So keeping that as a background, I've often felt that responsible tourism or sustainable tourism is often perceived, even at the policymaker level, as being very elite, as being non-inclusive, and only possible by a few who have access and privilege. And that seems to be the case. I mean, even if you look at ourselves in this panel, we are all privileged, we are all got a leg up, to begin with. How do we now, with these new sort of changing of power structures and these new realizations, and how we become more aware as people, can we look at how we really work as a business, as an entrepreneur, and then as a member of a community? And I'd like to start with Pooja on this one.
Yeah, great, thank you. Again, this is something that we can talk about for a long time. But what I'd like to say, I mean, looking at this idea of equitability and talking about privilege when it comes to responsible tourism, is that yes, I mean, I won't deny that I feel like very privileged. I mean, I've had an amazing opportunity to have good education, and being an avid traveler, I've traveled all over and had the opportunity to see different experiences all around the world. And I think that's an extreme privilege, because I can bring that into the background of the work that I do. But that being said, I think that being responsible, like Charmaine aptly put, like in a really beautiful way, is that it's everybody's choice, and everybody can take those responsibilities and those chances to make choices that are better for like the community and the environments around. Unfortunately, sometimes when it comes down to just looking at pure livelihood and the need for income generation, it becomes very hard for people who are in lower middle economic backgrounds to make those choices, because there's huge trade-offs that are involved in terms of taking care of their family and actually generating that income. So, we briefly chatted about this earlier, is that this idea that the reason that I think that we look at sustainable or responsible tourism as having this kind of elitist or maybe more expensive price tag when you look at these experiences, because a lot of times these structures and these services are actually created completely from scratch. So, if you look at all of us here, a lot of times what we've built is actually completely independent of any support system that exists anywhere. And that's because a lot of times we don't find that support from the government, whether that means infrastructure, basic infrastructure. For us, that could mean having toilets at certain places so everybody can use the toilet before going on a trip, or whether that means having access, wheelchair accessibility or access to different trails around. That just doesn't exist. So I think when we look at it, when we look at responsible tourism in that way, I think it does kind of give that impression that it has to be only for certain people, but it's not. It's actually for everybody, and everybody can make those choices as long as we receive some kind of support and kind of, basic infrastructure from the government in terms of the few things I mentioned, like infrastructure and having standards and practices. And I think kind of giving that training to everyone at a level really gives them the opportunity to decide how they want to run their business. And it's not dependent on trip to trip, but actually they can look at things over a long term and look at a larger scope and a bigger picture.
Yeah, I really like that point that you brought up, because it's something that we've often been asked in various meetings with the government, that if we ask for a higher price point for the dolphin trip, for example, citing that the operators are not making enough money, we get pushback saying, well, then you won't make it inclusive, and it's too expensive, and these are only for rich people, these activities. And at the same time, there's like, we want high end tourism, which, I mean, it bothers me, the term high end, low end, because I don't think that spectrum should be there only in the first place. But
Yeah.
anyway, Shamin, I'd like to, ask you to come in at this point and talk about a little bit where you see in Holland, as Pooja is mentioning, that we need better infrastructure for marine tourism in specific in Goa. What do you think should be started at the village level right up to the government level? And what do you think are the gaps you've seen now that you have not only grown up there, but now you also work there as a professional?
Some of these things you've heard me scream at our last nautical conference, but they still stay the same, like Pooja has mentioned. One of them being basic infrastructure like shower rooms. People end up in other people's houses. Even it's not just because we run water sports or because we offer these activities, but it's just a basic beachgoers experience. You come to a beach, we don't have access for handicapped people to get down on the beach. There's no ramp, there's no proper promenade, there's nothing to welcome you there. It look in there, like make it look nice so more people can come. There's spaces to sit, exchange either conversations, food, get information about that particular spot, be it the marine animals there, be it the flora and fauna. And obviously, it would help to have a shower and dry off once you're done, and not end up trying to walk into shacks or knock on people's doors because you need to change. Those things could the standard like you were mentioning earlier, we have to increase certain rates on certain trips because you need it's not so much back end logistics that goes
Yeah.
out there. Yourself getting refreshed. If there are women, kids, even guys for that matter, you need to have access to a toilet because anytime that you're running, you need access to water, you need access to drinking water.
Shamin, we're losing the last. Sorry, Shamin, one second. Shamin, we just lost the last two sentences. Could you please say that again? Hello?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry. Could you just start with that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Now, can you hear us?
I was just saying, winding up what I was saying. It's basic infrastructure that state tourism board. I mean, like in India itself, certain states, the tourism is doing a lot better than Goa. While we just find Goa talking about great tourism, they don't really seem to be doing what basic stuff like we've been discussing over here that can elevate basic, like simple experiences for us, as well as the travelers around, or even the locals that can, probably be more willing to participate and explore their backyards better. Proper trails marked, proper maps for things, simple stuff like that, whether it's sea or rivers or whatever we are exploring, is missing. But somehow, if you look at India, there are few states that stand out in terms of tourism, and there is a reason for it, right? They're doing something right to promote it that way, or they're pushing for certain tourists, and then it attracts an audience in return. But in India, we only, like in Goa for that matter, we just hear about it, but we're not seeing any of it happen. Some of the beaches that have toilets are not even open. So stuff like that probably can be improved or looked at, I think would make a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we face that obviously at the jetties as well. And one of the big challenges with waste
Yeah.
management is that nobody's collecting the waste. There's a jurisdiction issue where the beach cleaning staff doesn't come to the river mouth, the panchayat doesn't collect from the river mouth, or it has to be taken somewhere. And then the model of
Clashes between panchayats. Yeah.
clashes between panchayats, and also you have the problem of a
Yeah.
continuing boat cycle throughout the day, where it's not fixed time. So it's not like the operator knows that he'll finish work in the morning
Yeah.
and then he takes his waste. It's any time a trip can come, you're there from morning to evening, you're just sitting at the jetty. So a lot of manpower just being wasted, really.
Yeah.
And there is no diversification of revenue. It's not even like till
Yeah.
date you can't really buy a t-shirt which says humpback dolphin, or flame back of the forest, flame of the forest, or
Yeah.
anything. I've seen t-shirts
Yeah.
with elephant kicking a football at the jetties. Like it's the complete rebranding of Goa is always a topic that we discuss. So Joanna, I'd like to ask you, given that a lot of what Pooja and Charmaine are mentioning are pretty low cost infrastructure needed to really create what people perceive as an elite experience, right? I mean, it's considered elite because of the price point. And as they have pointed out, it's because the operator itself has to create that infrastructure and therefore charges a certain amount to recover that or to maintain it. So what do you think needs to happen in terms of larger community thinking, or is responsible tourism suffering a branding issue too? In terms of people thinking it needs a lot when it actually needs pretty simple investment.
Yeah, so I might start at the beginning of the question around justice. Necessarily seem to include just, and I think we need to be really, really clear to make sure that we put those together, sustainable and just, and that really speaks to people's rights, and as whether it's the animals and the wildlife who have rights to be there, or the local community residents. And of course we could get into a whole conversation about who is the resident of the village and insider outsider, but we'll leave that for another day. But I think there is a question around, to what extent are people involved in making decisions about how their location develops? And I think what would be interesting, and I know that Dean de Cruz has done a fair amount of work in this as well, but is looking at how can infrastructure serve various people. So you don't want, as a situation which has no public toilets for local peoples to use, but a nice little niche, gorgeous toilet that is just for like the rich people who come and and view. So and so I think there's something around how can tourism be a force for good that provides greater facilities and rights to the people on that place, so they can benefit themselves, even if not directly financially, but at least in terms of that infrastructure. So even, and another example might be transport. If we had a great public transport system, then local people could benefit from it as well as tourists. So I think this is absolutely the point, that if we want to elevate the standard of tourism infrastructure, we need to elevate the standard of local infrastructure. And of course, that will probably come down to a budget issue. But maybe there are opportunities for collaboration and sort of public-private partnerships that can really make sure that, maybe how do you mobilize the resources and the assets in a particular place to meet the needs? And I think there could be some really interesting initiatives to be done around that. Did I answer your question?
And I do. Yeah, I mean, well, I think the question I've asked is fairly broad, so maybe that needs to happen over a few different conversations on the different aspects of sustainability and tourism, because caste and class and privilege is such a complex topic. It's so pervasive, and it really does determine almost everything that a person is experiencing in our country, for sure, and economic class plays out in different ways in other parts. And I think it's important to remember that, and I like the way you have all encapsulated it, is that something gets to be seen as high-end, low-end, inclusive, exclusive, largely because we don't have an integrated approach to how we do things. And I like that you brought in the fact that unless we are looking at how infrastructure is going to help everybody, not just the person involved in that particular activity, we can't ignore the fact that even infrastructure that get built for a activity ends up impacting something else. So, for example, there is a road that's come up in Nerul, and it's obviously affected the mangroves, and downstream it will affect the fisheries that depend on that area, and activities like us which do kayaking and things over there, because now it's affected. And it's this lack of integration which brings me to the next theme that I'd like to touch upon, is that what do you think are the key ideas around resilience that need to be talked about more? And do you have an example or an approach that you want to talk about, how you would integrate, or how do you understand this integration of resilience as well as, promoting or growing a community and activity? How do you get the two to meet? Because resilience often talks about curbs, and development often talks about growth. And integration is something that we are all struggling with because of how many divisions there are at the social, economic, political, technical level. So starting with Joe, why don't you kick this round off and maybe touch upon how do you interpret integration and integrated resilience thinking in this space?
Yeah, thank you. So I feel that resilience is a huge subject, and it means, on the one hand, resilience to things like COVID and disaster, and that might mean climate change and water rising. It might also mean things around like food insecurity. It might mean resilience in terms of economic resilience. It might be economic. I mean, the world is also burning at the moment, so maybe it's also social resilience. How do we not get caught up in a wave of rioting and goodness knows what? So I think first of all, I just want to say it's huge, but for me, it's really about different stakeholders, and I'm biased because my work is multi-stakeholder about collaboration, but it's really about bringing people together to be able to listen to each other's realities, because at the moment it's very oppositional, and we could shout at each other to blue in the face, but I think what's really needed is to move beyond oppositional positions and to get into a space of, okay, let's understand at a deep level what some of the issues are and try and figure out ways to solve them. And I think for me that has to happen on the one hand at the local level, and also, so it has to be a bottom up and a top down thing. So that integration, unfortunately, is kind of very multi-pronged. It's between stakeholders, but it's also sort of between levels. And I'm excited because at the moment, I think there will be a phase 2, hopefully, for the resource efficiency. And I think we are looking at a village model, and to say, okay, how can this really work at the village for the village? I think there's also needs to be better communication and coordination between people doing things. I mean, Goa has a great set of active people doing work in this area, but we tend to be so busy that our heads are down. So certainly Act for Goa is a platform that we're in the process of setting up to try and figure out how can we join the dots between different people so that we don't duplicate our efforts, but also recognizing that everyone's working on very small budgets. So how do we maximize the potential of what each of us is doing and achieve more together than we could do alone? So I think there's that piece to it, and collaboration as well. But I also do think that there's something around really also bringing in some of the science in there. I know that there's amazing work that gets done in universities and by scientists to stay there, and we need to really help people understand the data, because whether it's people burning trash and not knowing it's toxic for them, or throwing their waste in the water and not understanding how it becomes fish, I think it's also a really important piece of public information and really accessible. So I think that there's steps towards that integration. So I think that's probably enough for me for now.
Pooja, building on that, I do agree that awareness, of course, is the first step before you even get to the point of thinking how things integrate and how can you build resilience in a holistic manner. What do you think are the other steps that one should be taking in the near and long-term future?
Yeah, I mean, to bounce off what Joe was saying, I think that kind of giving people at all different levels here that access to information, because like she mentioned, and like we know, it's sometimes we just don't make those connections. We don't know that what's happening in our, that the trash is actually linked to our food system, and our food systems into our body. And that's why, it might seem very clear to some of us, but that's because we've studied it and we've had that exposure for many years, and for people, sometimes when this is new, we talk about how this trash problem is a relatively new problem here in India. And so these problems are all, and the things that are the fallout is also relatively new. All of these diseases coming up, it's also relatively new. It's new for, if you look at the generation before, they're living till 90 to 100, and they're not really understanding how this gap is there. But another thing I think is really important is education all around. So not only just the awareness of that, but if you look at even just in terms of if you look at tourism specifically and you're looking at operators, I think that if operators are giving education and training in whatever field that, of course, they also have a lot of local knowledge about it. But if that education is brought out where, they're given training in first aid, for example, they're giving training in maybe a few different languages. It could be different language training. If they're given training in, in different customer service types things, these kinds of ideas, with that information, they can actually be resilient in terms of anything. They can change their model from maybe being completely tourism-based to follow more education, to follow all of these different things that are coming in, with conventions and that kind of thing. We get bigger groups also in Goa, weddings and that kind of thing. So there are a lot of different people coming in, but I think what happens is that only those who have that background where they can quickly change and adapt are able to make those adaptations. But I think that the locals and the communities have so much information, but if they just need access to more training and more skills that are really important in today's international global travel scenario, which, in terms, again, having this background of, the science, even as Joe mentioned, knowing what's around. I mean, of course, they'll probably be able to spot something before we will. That's just the reality of it. But maybe they might not know how that integrates and how that's important, or what that creature, what feeds on that creature, what that creature feeds on, and what role it plays in the ecosystem. Now, maybe we don't know that either, but we can find out and we can collaborate, share those resources, share that information, because everybody has something to bring to the table, But I think sharing that information, like she's saying, integrating it in that way where we all have different skill sets, but sometimes to give people a little more confidence in what they're doing, they can give them a lot more ways to think creatively and outside the box and think, okay, maybe I'm not going to get customers if I do it this way, but maybe I'll get customers if I do it this way, because that's actually greener and it's cheaper and it's more natural, So there's lots of different things they can think of once, I think, given the tools to think in different ways and enhance their own, local knowledge and amazing, things that they've been doing throughout the history, that kind of thing. So
yeah. No, I completely agree with that, because, we've seen it in our own model that the minute it started becoming about knowledge exchange, building better market linkages, working directly together on the trip as partners, it became much easier to translate some of these, what we consider as new ideas of responsibility, because that is innately how people are, I mean, the boat driver is innately conscious of the environment in which he's driving the boat. He's already much more sensitive and attuned to the animal than you are, because you're coming on that one trip, he's out every day. And the minute we open up the kind of situation that we're not teaching them or they're not teaching us, but we're learning from one another, it became a much more equitable experience to a large degree. And then when the economics start to make sense, then everybody, relaxes a little bit and is able to think of how to go forward. So that's very important. So Shamin, I mean, looking at, I think awareness building, knowledge exchange, of course, is very important. But there are certain, sort of contributions that policy and state or local communities have to make together to be able to create the platforms where such kind of things can actually take place, where that knowledge exchange or infrastructure can be discussed and done. So what would you like to see now that this pandemic has happened? A lot of us are having these conversations. Some of us have been having them together, like you and us, for quite a while now. And I think we all are a bit sort of at that stage where it's high time these things actually get done. So as a entrepreneur, I know we have to do it, but
it will come down to us only doing it together. So
well, hopefully that should not be the only core group that's left for everything. I think what I wanted to ask from you is, tell me some real next step actions. Like, what should we do after this? Do we get together? Do we reach out to the Vasco Panchayat? Do we talk to the Kalangut Panchayat? What are the kind of steps that you think, we should take and we can action together? And I'd like the other, both of you as well to think of that, because we'll do one more round of that, because I think it'll be important after this to really make sure that, and I certainly will do that. I will follow up and make sure we get some of these things done, because otherwise we are simply one more conversation on the web, and that's really not the purpose of this. So Shamin, please add your steps.
I would say, yeah, if you're talking about steps, there are two broad categories over here. One would be support and steps and methods and things that come from the tourism and the state itself. A lot of it which is not easily accessible. Like, how difficult it was when you guys started certain things, and I've known how difficult it's been for me. It's not accessible. It's not easily out there in one page format that says, okay, this is what I need to do. Many of the policies are redundant. They don't even make sense. They are not practical at all, economically and just general sense of the word for operations per se. None of it is practical. This might be a really good time to have that dialogue with policymakers and people involved.
Shamin Santi, can you give an example? I know that the kayak, we've had some conversations around the water sports policy. Could you give some real-time examples of where you think the policy needs work?
Rules and regulations, for that matter, if I were to, it might be a long rant and I don't want to get into it, but just to try and keep it as short as possible. For example, when it comes to just rules with kayaking, if I were to narrow it down to that, we don't get permissions for kayaking in like per se. It's not permission that you'll receive for kayaking. I need to get permission for each kayak. And that itself becomes a huge difference. They consider everything with water sports, and it's given a very road sort of ruling. The numbering system, the fees, the taxes that you need to pay, everything is considered separately, which for operations like mine and maybe yours also, it is difficult. If you have to pay for each kayak to get permission and not for kayaking, adds to cost. It makes it difficult. And again, it's not a one point or one window system for permission. I have to go to 2-3 different bodies, get all the different paperwork, then come back to one body, put it in there. It's a lot of time, energy, funds, fees being paid at different places, which is not convenient. It's not easy. Somebody who wants to start, when they think about all that, not everyone feels motivated and encouraged. Secondly, water sports in general for Goa, you do not really get permissions year round if you're an operator for just the sea. We barely get a 6 to 8 month season depending on how the monsoons take off and stuff like that, which again is not viable. And rules like 2 nautical miles, you can't kayak beyond that. When we are talking about the coast in Goa, if you promote stuff like marine tourism, which is what today is all about, circuit tourism can be created, right? Like, you can literally have people kayaking, simultaneously cycling along the entire coastline of Goa. It would benefit so many people. If you're putting a rule like I can't kayak beyond a certain distance, what is the point of me even doing it if I can't explore that coast? There are so many people that could benefit from something as changing that very simple rule. Homestays along the way can be picked up. Beaches that are not that are always more popular than the others, can change that attention. Some of the crowd that comes just to one popular beach or becomes popular in other smaller spaces or other bigger beaches or better beaches, they get noticed. And they're not always noticed because there's not much written about them, or people don't tend to visit them. And obviously the view is different from the sea. But it's just a small example like that can sort of change, or that can be implemented. And the other thing, in terms of, obviously it is working together. Somehow we were discussing this before we went live. I think collaborations are key. All of us are in the same workspace, and somehow competition, if we work collaboratively, or if we work...
I lost you. Okay. I see Joe back now. Sorry, we just sort of went dead there suddenly.
No problem.
Okay. Can everybody hear and see each other now again?
Yes.
Okay.
I was just finishing off what I was saying.
Yes,
so one was the policymakers and things like that, and the second would be all of us. Like I was saying, everyone is sort of scared and looks at each other as competition. But if I were to just broadly give an example, a place like Las Vegas, the whole place is full of casinos and gambling. It's not like a new one doesn't pop up every now and then. And people still go there, right? It is because it is that hub, it attracts that audience there. If more of us came together to promote what we are doing and worked together, I don't see why we can't attract that same audience here as a collective force than all of us fighting for it individually or trying to promote ourselves individually. So,
yeah, absolutely.
I think benefits.
Yeah. Sorry, finish your point.
Sorry. No, I was just adding to it, like looking at collaborations and talking about the boat guys and some of the lower end operators, or rather those who are struggling, as you were mentioning earlier. If they are not in capacity to operate directly, but even collaborations with them or tie-ups with them, sort of, even if it enables them in some way to give them some sort of an income, I think at this point it's better than nothing, is what I would say to look at.
I do agree that, going away from an individualized approach to actually marketing activities. So, making a kayaking hub, a cycling hub. I know there are islands, for example, in Thailand, which are known for diving, or they're known for something. And then, a lot of those similar-minded operators then congregate. And it becomes a supportive ecosystem in which you can function, because you are working with others who understand your business and the challenges, and you're actually supporting each other. So, awareness, knowledge exchange, building capacity, collaborating, these are some of the key immediate steps that we need to. And I think there are a lot of platforms in Goa where that can happen. But Pooja, could you add to that a little bit and tell me what kind of a role, or where do you think the bottlenecks are with these collaborative actions? Because I know they've been tried several times, and sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. But in tourism, it seems to be particularly hard to get people to, put in time and work on this, especially because many are out running their own activities. So what are some of the key things that you think need to happen to revive some of these efforts?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And we've talked about this a few times, I think, even in relation to the RTC, which I'll get to in a second. But I think, I think that being collaborative is working together is one of the best ways that we can kind of tackle this issue. Like you aptly mentioned, Charmaine, I mean, just because there are a handful of us tours providers here, that doesn't mean that we're working against each other. Actually, the number of tours that are coming in terms of domestic tourists nowadays, not with COVID, but looking before this happened, the numbers are huge. And it's just about also helping change the mindset of what people can do when they reach a place like this. So, I mean, we've talked about this a few times, I think, but because a lot of us are operating at a very much of an individual level, we have to do so much. We have to not only do the branding of Goa, like we talk about, you convince people to come here. Once they get here, we do everything to let them see the side that we see, the greener Goa, the beautiful Goa, the culture, everything that's part of the reason we're here. We have to do the branding. We have to do the infrastructure, which is a lot for us. Like if we're taking a group out camping, we physically built a toilet. It's an compost toilet that we've had to build because there's nothing nearby. And what are we going to do? So we spend so much of our time and our resources doing those kinds of things. And it again comes down to training. So training the people that we work with, training the communities that we work with, and sometimes things that practices that they can often be trained on, because these are now practices that are kind of incorporated all over the world. So I think that's where a lot of our time goes, and a lot of our resources as well. And so when we look at collaborating in particular, I think you're right. The seasons here are very small. We look at about a 6 to 8 month season for a lot of these outdoor adventures. And so at that time, we also don't have that much time to think about, okay, how can we be part of a collective, and everybody's on a different schedule. A lot of times people are out on a different side of Goa, which a lot of times might not have connectivity. There's just a lot of things, and everything gets really kind of compressed into the 6 to 8 month window. And then the rest of the time we're like, oh, let's breathe a little bit, because we've just been doing all of these things that we never maybe even meant to do when we started a business. I never wanted to be a social media active person, but now I have to be because these are the things that matter, So I think what would be really cool. I mean, when you look at different industries across the world, you look at teachers across the world, they have a cooperative, they have a coalition, they have backing, they have a stand, and I think as operators of tourism, we don't really have that. We have no one that's supporting us. Not only talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about money, but just in terms of, like you're saying, Charmaine, having the policies be easy. Like for me to register my business, it took me 2 or 3 years, because I just couldn't figure it out, and I didn't know who to ask. Yeah. And so the policies are really hard. Like I said, basic things on these infrastructure that we talked about. But it's if we had somebody, in the government that was kind of on our side, a liaison, somebody that we could all. We have so many ideas, all of us. So we're talking so animated. I'm so excited. I'm talking very fast because we all are passionate about this. We have so many ideas, but unfortunately, sometimes there's no avenue to where we can share them. And if we're sharing them, it's to a blank wall or to each other, which is great. But we all are kind of around the same page with a lot of this stuff. So we really need to be reaching out to others, to get them on to see what are the issues. But I think if there was some kind of cooperative type situation where maybe all the boat owners kind of got together and, they did something where they all attracted tourists, for, let's say they're doing dolphin watching, they all attract tourists. And then, it gets separated and they get a number and they can go out with any operator. And all the operators are getting the same amount of money and they're all being trained and they all have to keep up to a standard. And I think this comes back to this idea of standards that I kind of relate to a lot. I mean, I'm a diver. So for us, standards are just everything that we dive by is standards, And if you don't have standards, then there's chances of really lack of safety, which is what happens sometimes when people go out and they do things and then it ruins everything for everybody else who's been doing things the right way, and the very accurate and safe. So standards in that way are really important. And then also just having that voice somewhere where we can actually, someone on the government who's on our side who can listen to these things and say, oh, this is coming from a group of industry professionals. This is what we need to do. We have, luckily, because Goa is such a small state and you have access to people and you have access to these ideas and these suggestions, it has a direct route, it's just that we need somebody to be on our side to say, hey, let's try to change Goa. Goa doesn't have to be like the rest of India. And its colonial past is very different. Goa can be completely different. Goa can set a new standard that's on par with Costa Rica and New Zealand, all of these really awesome world-class destinations, because it has the environment, it has the culture, it has everything, but it doesn't have the
and it's the small states that you can make those changes possible to try stuff. But a small state, and it's easier to experiment in a way or to try certain things and see if it goes or doesn't go.
Yeah,
exactly.
Let's stay on that a little bit and bring Joanna in as well. I faced similar problems when I went to register as a marine guide, which is what I see myself as, because I don't actually own the boat or drive the boat. And the tourism department kept insisting that I should do the training for Old Goa culture guide, the guide training that they have, and they didn't even have something like a marine guide to look at, which obviously shows how far the ecosystem is really from the mind space of people who are deciding these things. Government gaps, of course, are there, but there have been several engagements. We've all been part of a lot of stakeholder consultations where government has also been part of it. And actually, when I put up this video later, I will be putting a link to the Ecotourism Society of India workshop report that we did with Joanna, so that people can revisit that, because there's a lots of conversations that were had and harvested for that report. And a lot of this is in there, this kind of infrastructure. But just coming back again to, and I know, Joanna, you're part of so much of this movement building efforts. You teach methodologies on how people can, talk to each other and have these conversations. But increasingly, we are finding more and more of us getting sort of disillusioned with that process because it doesn't go anywhere. People put in time, they meet, and then, the ideas don't action. What do you think is really holding us from taking ownership as a collective, getting some of these things done, putting in resources, raising resources? What do you think are the bottlenecks that one should be looking at now if we want to revive these efforts? Joanna? Oh no. Did she not hear me?
That is a long one, Pooja.
I know. I was trying to give my point and then end with the question. I think why don't you guys take it till we add her back on? Shamin, you want to start like some of the bottlenecks that you may have faced as a member of, many of these?
I'm honestly not sure what's stopping things because, Pooja, you were part of a nautical tourism conference that we did about 2 years ago. One of the things on this for that marine tourism that came about, it was your point where you had suggested how Goa could use, segregations on our coast for motorized and non-motorized boats. And I was part of the team that followed up. Till now, nothing has come out from it. There were people who were following up on behalf of us, and somehow it just fizzled out. So I don't know where that connect is or how we can make these things actually happen or who needs to be held responsible. Seems like maybe Joanna could shed some light on it because she's working more closely with this. But that is also my question because we have all these things that are going.
Because maybe Shamin and Pooja, either of you can respond to this. I've always wondered, is it because we shy away from being politically active? A lot of people who are in this space, who are nature loving, who want to talk about these things, ultimately you are working in a socio-political environment. It needs you to go and engage with it politically as well. Do you think those are things that we as entrepreneurs or as practitioners need to ask ourselves first? That, if we only don't want to get engaged beyond the point, then why would somebody else who hasn't even had the privilege and access and exposure and everything that we have? So do you think that is really a big gap that our segment of people often face, operators who like to do things on their own, but when it comes to really sitting at the government's office and sort of hammering away at a point, we don't really put in the time to do that.
I would beg to differ. I think there are a lot of us that are within the community who do a lot of things, whether it means writing letters for conservation, whether that means, following up, attending these different conferences about like circular economy that Joanna had was part of leading last year and different things like this and like the nautical conference that you mentioned. I think that we do our part, but I think this is really where you see government's role to step in. Recently the government had the issued KPMG to give some recommendations on tourism, right? And we all scoffed at it because it was quite expensive and it took them a long time, et cetera, et cetera. But if you go through those, hundreds of pages, which I recently redid, a couple of days ago, you really realize that there are some really great. Joanna's back, so I'll just finish this up, and then we can kind of let you know where we've gone. But there's a lot of really amazing recommendations in there, and they talk a lot about these things, about infrastructure, and So I'm actually wondering what the hesitation on the government side is. Why aren't they taking up these recommendations by KPMG? Because like I just mentioned, we do scoff at them because they did take a long time. They spent a lot of money. They asked people from outside Goa. They could have gotten it from inside Goa. But they did get these awesome recommendations. And these are great. And a lot of them are quite spot on. So why are we not following them? What is the issue? Is the issue they don't think there's enough money in it? Is the issue they don't find any incentive with it because they get more money when they sell the forests for timber and to set up lines and highways and all the other things that are happening right now in the forest? Or like, what is the issue? And where, I don't even know myself, like you mentioned, Charmaine, I don't know where the bottleneck is because I don't think as entrepreneurs, we're in charge of governance, but I do think that we are responsible for our own activities and making sure that they're responsible. And of course, being the liaison, but then we liaison with another body that already exists for that purpose, So
that's interesting that you say that because a lot of, I've been asking the same question and, we've been on so many panels and committees that we have given possibly the same recommendation in a multiple way to the point where I've been quite sort of reticent about going again and joining some other platform because I'm sort of tired of seeing the vision and what steps we should take. And I've been asking myself that, where are we really hitting that bottleneck? Is it because I'm not sitting in the tourism department office every day and going on asking the tourism director, when will this get done? Is that what it's going to take? And Joanna, now that you're back on and you've had so much experience, trying to hold these spaces for people and trying to keep that engagement going, and not to mention written these reports actually yourself, which have then gone around to all these departments. So what is it that we now need to change perhaps in our behavior as practitioners? How do we motivate ourselves to keep going in this space and doing these things? And what do you practically see as the bottlenecks in this kind of community action and liaising that we are trying to do?
Oh, good question. So when you asked the question at the beginning of this round, and I was thinking, like, what are the things that we could actually do? Like, what needs to happen? And I just want to just follow up on those because I think they're linked. Yeah. Because I think on the one hand, I think this whole new story for Goa is fundamental. It comes at us from everywhere. And I think engaging people in those conversations and the policymakers is really important. And I don't think we've necessarily done that around a vision. So I think that's a very concrete step that we should sort of imagine Goa 2030. Or Goa 2050.
What do you mean that we haven't engaged them around a vision?
Well, my sense is that I don't personally know of, like, at the moment we know we have Goa is the party place, just gambling, drinking, drugs, dancing. These are the things that we know that Goa is being sold as. And I think there's, obviously it's based where people feel that, they can come to Goa and be really free to do anything they want. And I think that at the moment, anyway, outside of this COVID experience, we anyway needed to massively rebrand Goa. But I think the second point I wanted to make is, I don't know that this is going to recover. No one wants to talk about it, but actually this may never recover. And so I think we need to have a really radical conversation about the future of Goa. Like, what if, because I don't think that there is a plan A. And so I do think we need to really think, where do we want to be in 20 years' time? What's the Goa we want to have? And therefore, what needs to be part of that? So I think we need a radical conversation that looks not at the wishful thinking, everything will pick up in the tourism sector by October, but what if it doesn't? What if this never recovers? What if, and to think through that. And then I think linked to that, I think we need some kind of, and maybe this already exists, but it's not effective, but the kind of jurisdiction issues that were being spoken to before, like, we absolutely need to bring different government departments together on the same table, because it's too easy to sort of hide behind the fact that there are competing interests and conflicting interests between government departments. And as long as that's the case, we can shout to a blue in the face, but there's the door isn't open at the government level. And it's not only ill will. I think it's also just a complicated, confused system that needs clarification. And I think that needs to happen. And I also feel like we do need to get more data on the kind of resilience forecasting, the capacity forecasting, and understand that piece. So just on those pieces. But in terms of the bottlenecks, I do still think that as long as people think that things can continue as they have been, no one's going to be very motivated to change. And in some ways, although I'm not happy about the disasters that are happening, but at the same time, they're just indicators of what we've been saying for some time, which is things need to change because there are bad things on the horizon. And now these bad things are no longer on the horizon, they're in the foreground. And maybe this will now make us have to, sit down and really make some decisions. Or maybe it's going to take a lot more catastrophes happening for us to realize that we really need to drastically rethink things. But I think that a key thing we can do is find champions who get it across different stakeholders in business, in government, identify them, and then together start to look at a sort of multi-stakeholder sort of drive for a new vision for tourism and the role it plays in the Goan economy and communities. Maybe. So
that's great. I mean, I think let's just talk a little bit based on this, what you've said, because, you did mention earlier that there is going to be a phase 2 of the resource efficiency and there will be scope to create these conversations. And I think that's something we can definitely, all of us, work on the next few weeks to put some plans together of what those conversations and where should we have them and what should we be talking about and really what can we action. What can we get done at the village level, at the industry level? And coming to your point, Pooja, about, the boat associations being organized, going in numbers, they do have that already in some parts. But the problem really, again, in their case is the price point. It's because it's so low, even though they're in a queue system, though they have to still do volume to make money. So the queue system is counterproductive for them personally. So they keep trying to get out of the queue and doing special trips and alcohol and this and that and other ways to try and, make money. Which is why our trip goes out so early, because we're not in the queue system. The boat wants to go separately, and then they make, room for that. So I'd like to talk about this a little more in terms of what Joanna said, and what I've also been feeling is that the conversations I've been either part of or watching around tourism, and not just for marine and coast, but for others, are really about, we just have to get through. We should be more environmentally sensitive. We should be more sustainable. But, by and large, there's room for everybody. And what if there isn't? And if the economic decline and, the way things are going in the world, we might even be heading to a lot of global conflict. And, that's going to change a lot of dynamics in terms of how people travel, what they choose to do with their time and money. Do they have the money? So can we talk a little bit in the last section of this conversation, which is it's been so wonderful. I mean, I want to, each of this we can keep talking, and we should, and I think I will make themes around that. But this last section, can we talk about what if there isn't tourism the way we think it is? What if that market isn't going to come back for a couple of years, and the skills that we have, this experience that we have, these brands that we've built, and we now need to diversify ourselves or change ourselves? Where are you in terms of, and I think, Joanna, please start off this, because you can help to set the meta conversation around what people need to be thinking. So maybe build on your point about diversification. But then when we come to Pooja and Charmaine, and I'll also sort of think of this, what can we do really now for our business models? And should we be thinking about that, or should we be kind of going with things might come back in a certain way? And how prepared are we if they don't? So Joanna, would you start that off, please?
Yeah. So I think what we've seen with this COVID situation is that whilst it might have been a health issue, it's just snowballed into a mental health issue now, and a domestic violence issue, and a food security issue, and all of these things. And so for me, I think that within Goa, even if there is no outside tourism, there are people who need time out with their families, for mental well-being, to be out in nature. They need to be thinking of things to do with their kids, so they're not stuck on an iPad or a screen or a computer or a phone, which is a horrific situation. A lot of people are worried about it. And there's been a massive shift in the sort of social norms of people. And I think that, what if there were, what if the market was people who are here? And I think on one of the groups, people were talking about staycations, but maybe there's something which is about meeting local need with local offers. Yes. And about creating the potential for people to visit the state, to get to know it. And we can build resilience that way. And then when things start to open up, then we can sort of offer these out further afield. But maybe our prime target needn't be a high-end paying tourist. And then obviously there are financial implications for that. And that's maybe where we then look at, people who can collaborate to support, and whether that's the government or whether that's private business or whatever. But I think we could look at how do we make local people into customers of quality nature-based or responsible tourism. And then, that's what first comes to mind, is that maybe in the same way that facilities should be accessed by local people, maybe some of these trips need to be found, what's needed for you guys to get to a price point that it can be affordable for families here, local families here. Obviously not necessarily the poorest of the poor, but also, what's needed. And is that, an infrastructure? But then, so maybe then that's a conversation. But that's what first comes to mind, is that there's a whole market of people who need something. There's very little to offer if you're a family with kids here in terms of options, and the kind of trips that you guys do are exactly what I think people want to take their kids on. So there's a market there, but maybe it's just the price point needs to be figured out or something. That's what off the top of my mind. Sorry.
Yeah. Pooja?
Yeah, I mean, I think Yeah, there's a lot of things, a lot of points to jump in on. First, I think one of the main things is doing actually having a private-public partnership. I think having more of these partnerships here with whether it be local panchayats or local schools. I think there needs to be more of an understanding. And I think, like you mentioned, Joe, this idea of staycation, Goa is amazing. And I think if you ask most people here, maybe aside from present company excluded, have you been to, some of the best beaches across the state? Maybe they haven't, it's been on their bucket list. Have you been to one of the 5 wildlife sanctuaries or the 1 national park or the bird sanctuary? Most people probably couldn't check those off, but maybe they've been to tons of places in Himachal or, Karnataka or, outside India, Maldives, et cetera, But Goa has, one of the main reasons I live here is because I choose to live here is because of the vast biodiversity and the diversity of ecosystems and what you can see from your window, what you can see from half an hour away, what you can see from an hour away, what you can see from 2 hours away, And I consider myself so lucky to be here, And one of our favorite things actually is when local families do sign up for our adventures, because we talk about this price point, but actually the price point is not that high. Maybe if you're a completely very low income family and it's very difficult for you to get out, but we're open to subsidizing those trips, and we just want people to get outside. We obviously want our costs to be covered, but we want people to get outside and to realize how beautiful it is and to explore, and then to want to keep going outside in a responsible way with their friends and their families and their neighbors. So for us, reaching out to locals is one of our favorite things because it's their Goa. I'm a visitor here and now I call it my home, but to see somebody who's grown up in Mapsa, who's never been maybe to Asagaon, it's just, for us, it's wow, and they're eating berries that they hadn't eaten since they were a child, like Karvanda berries and Kanta, and they're picking them off the trees, and they're this reminds me of when my mom used to take me in her arms, and I used to go, and it's just amazing, and it's really sad that that's not more accessible for people, but that's, for us, it's one of our favorite things, so we would love to be able to do that more often. And that, of course, comes with more awareness and more marketing and, again, things that we're not necessarily able to do all on our own. So, coming together as a community of experienced operators that we can do it. And again, this price point comes up a few times, but I'd like to add that I feel a lot of people that maybe don't choose to spend, X amount of money on a trip to a waterfall or X amount of money on a dolphin trip might spend that same amount of money if they send them to a casino, or if you sent them to a bar, or if you sent them to a fancy restaurant. I think that we put our values in different places. And I think that when people, I would probably say that 99% of our customers, whenever they've come with us, maybe have said something in the beginning. A few of them might have said something, maybe 10%. But by the end, they were wow, I had never seen this before. And they're and that feeling is priceless, because then they can go and share their neighbors, and then they can go there themselves. We're never saying we have to be the only ones to take you into the forest or take you on a boat trip or, do anything or go on a bicycle ride. We want people to keep exploring. So yeah, anyway, really excited about this. Sorry, I'm rambling, but I think I think reaching out to locals is a really great way. And I think there's so many people like us also who've come, a few of us who've come from other places. I think settlers who are here also have a chance to explore, and that's a really huge market. And I think one thing that we like to do as Koja is that while we do work in tourism and maybe we call ourselves travel operators, we really call ourselves an education company because everything we do, we try to educate people and also learn ourselves. We're not always, I don't know every species of everything that's around me, but if I don't know it, then I want to connect you with somebody that does, because hey, we're in Goa and there is somebody that knows about ants. There is somebody that knows about dragonflies. There are amazing people here, and we're so lucky to be a part of this community. And if we don't learn about what's outside around us in our backyard, then what's the point of going across the world to another location? Because we don't even know the richness and the vastness that's literally outside most of our windows, So that's what I'd say about that.
Yeah, and I've also had that similar experience where I've had students come out with me from Don Bosco College who've gone out on a dolphin trip for the first time, come to Kalangut for the first time because their families don't think it's safe for them to travel in Kalangut and Baga, and it's seen as a den of vice and contain the tourists there. And I can understand why that sentiment is there. But when they went out and they started seeing the issues, and because of as Pooja said, we also see ourselves as educating first, and travel just happens to be a tool of that education. There was such a sense of ownership that what is happening to my bay and what is happening to my dolphins, and how was I not aware of this, and what can I do about it? And of course, for various reasons, these kind of sparks need to be harnessed. And again, it comes down to capacity and bandwidth, and you can't really, hold everything. And that's what I have struggled with a lot as a practitioner and as somebody who believes in the community efforts to try and keep people together, keep them engaged. So coming back to, we have the last 10 minutes before we wrap up. So I was just thinking, could we spend the last 10 minutes maybe talking a little bit about what each of us are willing to or are already doing to try and get some of these things off the ground that we've been talking about, or revive them. And Shamin, could we start with you?
First of all, Pooja and Joanna both covered most of the points when it comes to local tourism and things like that. I just want to say, yes, there is a huge market, and Sahasi's practically been surviving on very much Goans and locals as compared to tourists and foreigners and things like that. So this will be a great opportunity for all the other operators here, because I feel all the people that are here, whether stuck or not, or whether they are locals, they are now going to look at exploring their own backyard.
Yeah.
You want to lessen your impact, whether you're traveling or whether you want to keep it short and simple. So, which is why I was saying collaborations could work, because if I'm getting a call from the north, for the safety of my customer as well as maybe myself, I don't want him or her to travel. If we tied up with someone in the north, it's still a customer gain, and it's the revenue is sort of split between two people. The other thing that is going to happen, I think all the solo travelers are going to be happy. The outdoors is a great space for social distancing. You can be out in the sea and be the only person out there. You can be up on a hike and be the only person out there. It's just how we as individual operators look at safety practices that we can, keep for ourselves and our guests. But I don't see it stopping, because I think it's a great way to kind of energies, like Joanna was mentioning earlier. When it comes to water sports, couple of the centers in different parts of the world, motorized sports is sort of taking a backstand, or this is just something I'm sharing. I don't know how rules and regulations will come about in Goa, but one of the articles I read mentioned where motorized sport was temporarily banned because it involves more resources, or you need fuel, you need more people to push a boat out, you need multiple people to move a jet ski out. But if you're looking at non-motorized activities, or if you're looking at hikes and treks, it's something somebody can do by themselves. It's like pretty much a solo activity. One person can take a kayak and get out by him or herself, and it's a lot safer that way. The contacts that you're keeping COVID in mind, the contact you're exchanging between somebody is a lot lesser. I think during this time also,
Sorry, what was that? The last bit?
Yeah, the flight, I just said, sorry for that. During this time where there is a bit of a lull and where things are on a hold, I feel it's a good time to kind of have those dialogues and revive certain policies, revive certain things, because we have the time to revamp of sorts, put things in place, decide on the new habits we might want to inculcate going forward. Or else, even if it does go back, it's very easy to go back to old habits because we're so used to it. So maybe it's a good time to sort of think about that. And I also feel during this time, because we were discussing quality versus quantity and how the whole revenue thing is going to come about, giving an example from the diving industry, Pooja, you might know how this works in Goa, where we have some operators.
Sorry, Shamin, missed
that in the 3 and 5,000. Hello?
Yeah, just that last sentence.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying this, during this time, it might also work out, or it might so happen that certain standards, like Pooja was mentioning earlier, might come into play or might come into picture, because right now it's not one operator's problem. Everyone's sort of in the same situation. We're all starting at the same step all over again of sorts. No one is one up or the other. And the safety measures that we have to take in place, the things that we need to do, we all have to do it similarly. I can't be doing anything different that you are, because then obviously it doesn't make sense. So keeping that thought in mind, I feel a lot of those rules, regulations, pricing standards are going to come into picture, where somebody is not going to be able to sell a 500 rupee dive trip when the rest are trying to sell it for 5,000. I think that bridge is somehow going to be bridged, or rather it has the opportunity to sort of, come closer, that those numbers to kind of make more sense, wherein that standard sort of gets created, because you have to do certain things and you can't be fooling people anymore. Your customer or your traveler is also going to be researching the operator a lot more, keeping safety in mind. They're going to be reading a lot more about you. They're going to want to make sure that you are somebody they want to go to, and you're doing everything in your power to fulfill those standards of quality as well as safety. So I think it's no longer going to be, a huge difference between operators, operations, between certain things. I think these few months, we might see that transition happen where that standard sort of comes into picture. That's all
I would say, right, that, I do think that there will be something. What is that? Like the
right.
Well, I guess activity probably in the skies to begin with, and I don't know what that portends for all of us as well, because that also means people are arriving. Okay, so that's the last sort of, I just want to say that this has, been so great, but can we just continue, and Pooja and Joanna, if we could just, before we close the session, talk a little bit about what are the next steps and what can you as a business do to support this collaboration. So Pooja, would you like to, or Joanna, why don't you start and then we'll end with Pooja.
I think it's really about mobilizing at a bigger level. And I think maybe it's about maybe it's about a campaign. Like maybe we need to actually mount a campaign, which is and radio, and use the tools available to us, and speak to that vision of Goa that we want, and engage people, because I think people are pretty low at the moment also. But I agree with what Charmaine was saying, that now's the time for dialogue. Like it's all on pause. So let's take a stop. Let's take a breath. Slow down and be considered about what are the conversations that really need to happen, and be brave about them, and look at some scenarios that range from the ideal to the absolutely catastrophic, and look at those and do some scenario planning. That could be a really helpful thing to do. And then meanwhile build a sort of platform of people who really genuinely want a different story for Goa, in particular around tourism, and start to sort of to get that to build up, so that if tourism does come back and people are pushing for it to be the kind of extractive tourism, that is not very responsible, then we've at least developed a body and a voice and a kind of momentum of people who can say, no, we want something different. Because ultimately, like we said at the beginning, it's about what people choose. It's not about whether people are coming here looking for snow parks. If we tell them this is what we've got, and this is what we want, then people who want snow parks can go somewhere else.
Yeah, and I think people around the world are questioning really their choices. Pooja, what do you? How would you like to, take this forward? Some of the recommendations that you've given.
Yeah, I think just piggybacking off what Joanna and Charmaine just said, I think this is the best time for a dialogue. Anyway, it's monsoon. Anyway, we're coming off a few months of a lockdown, which we really don't know what's going to happen when we go back on the other side. So I think this is a great chance for brainstorming, and I think this is a chance for some real change. Like I had mentioned before, I feel like Goa's really in this special state, a special place that it really can go in either direction right now. And I think it's really exciting, but it's also really scary, because I really wanted to go in a certain direction, But I really feel like we have the resources, and we have the, a lot of the background information, we have the knowledge, we have the know-how within the state to do that. It's just a matter of, I guess, connecting with the right people and people of power and seeing if they also feel that that vision is worth it to them, whether it means for them to stand up to their colleagues, whether it means for them to, it means less money because maybe development of responsible tourism is less than development of power lines, different things like that. So I think for us, it's really about convincing the people in power, I think right now that, and maybe it's through this media campaign, that's a really great idea. I think we can get media partners on our side at this time too, because I think everybody I think is in this space where they back and get back into something that seems like we were more familiar with. It's this idea of what is normal, what is okay, what do we want the future of Goa to look like.
Everyone is
have that in our hands. It's really, it's a really nice time. And like we look at this idea of like changing the paradigm, changing the way that we're thinking about things. You mentioned the queues, and we briefly talked about the queues at the boat operators, but that can be changed. That can be where these guys have this awesome place where they're hanging out and they're waiting. And while they're waiting, they're learning about the marine stuff. And while you're sitting there, you see a video and you're seeing like drawings from kids. I mean, we can change the paradigm, like the way that things are right now is not, I don't think, the ideal, and I think it's quite far from it. But I think where it can go and what we can do. And I think one important thing also is someone had mentioned, I'm not sure who earlier, about not having so many facts, gathering the data. And I'm right now we're a few people in the tourism industry are pulling together some facts and data because we're trying to write a letter towards some of the stuff that's happening in the forest. And there's no data. There are, we spoke to the RFO today, and he told me he didn't know how many people visited the wildlife sanctuary last year. Now, I don't know if that's something he's trying to hide from me or if that's the realistic situation, but that's crazy. If you don't know how many people visited last year, then how do you know what number you want to get it to? Or how do you know what you can do with that huge number of people that visited and what you can do to make their experience even better, make it safer, make it more full of education and learning and exploration if you don't know, So I think a lot of it is like trying to get those data, getting data in place where we can get that data and pull it together. And I think that the government has done a lot in terms of getting these recommendations from KPMG. I mean, like I said, that whole thing is very controversial, but the recommendations are there. If we can just implement some of them and we can talk about which ones, how we want to implement them, then that'll be great, because I think there are some in there that are really in line with what we're saying. They're not very different, actually. Maybe they're presented in different words, but I think that a lot of that information is there, and it's just about like saying like, hey, you paid for the information. You waited 5 or 7 years for it. Now let's take it and decide what we're going to do in step 1, step 2, step 3. And like you're saying, Joanna, like in different scenarios, because even if things went back to like exactly how they were, which I kind of hope they don't, but if they did, everything is still going to be different in terms of how you're saying, Charmaine, like in terms of the safety protocols, the quality, the standards, and these all have to be revamped, but they have to be written, because I don't think they really exist for the kind of tourism that we're talking about, which isn't falling into a box of motorized versus necessarily non-motorized, but it's like local, community-driven, community-based, training locals, giving local opportunities for livelihood that maybe they didn't even existed. Who knew by speaking Spanish and walking backwards, they could give a tour, and make a lot of money. Like it's just there's things that are even outside of our own heads, and I think coming together and having this is a really nice way for us to share our thoughts, our passions, our questions. And I think even just sitting here with you four ladies for the last hour and a half, I've like, my mind is already going and I'm excited and I'm re-energized, like there's so many things. And I really hope that we can find a way to take this conversation forward, because
we will. I mean, we're completely out of time, so we're going to wind it up. But I think what I'm going to do, and I really I really thank all three of you for taking the time and sharing so much. And it's obviously clear that the themes we've touched upon, we need to keep talking about them and really coming up with a plan. So what I'm going to do is that Terra Conscious, I think, can anchor this media campaign. I think that's sometimes what, if you ask me what the bottlenecks are, I think it's the lack of a coordinator. It just comes down to that. Someone who's going to email everybody and tell everybody, meet now, call now. Yeah, I know. So as you said, it comes down to everybody, and then within that, it comes down to me. So I think what we are going to do is let's revive the conversation at the RTC.
Along with you for a lot of things.
Yeah. Shami, listen, what I'm thinking is let's revive the RTC, because that is a platform that's already been created. Let's anchor the media campaign with the RTC, and Terra Conscious can do a bit of the administrative coordination as we used to before. And, we stepped away because we were ramping up, but clearly we are not ramping up anytime soon. So we now have time to look at this. Sorry,
I'm happy to jump in, and Circlewallas can offer to support some dialogues.
Yeah, and I think the RTC should plan for the resource efficiency phase 2 and look at how it can support whatever conversations need to happen there, because there's some good talent and ideas in the RTC pool to begin with, and then we can reach out to other activists and other groups that are already Act for Goa. There are community groups at the village level that are already taking steps and doing lots of interesting things. And I also feel that within the RTC, some of us can take up the responsibility of collecting some of this data. I think even documenting how villages are responding, how local village level associations might be responding, how other operators are responding, and just collecting that information so that it can help to fuel the positivity campaign, which is like, look, we're already doing it. So it's not that we've kind of, thrown up our hands and we're waiting for some solution from elsewhere. So we'll definitely follow up on that, and more power to all of you, and look forward to, having more of these conversations down, in the next couple of weeks. And great to see you all. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your wonderful facilitation, Pooja. Also, it was great to be here.
And I'm so happy it's all women talking.
Yay.
And I want to also thank Marisha and Kim for all the back-end handling that they've done, because they've been logging people on and logging them off and doing all that. So thanks, Kim and Marisha, and thanks to Pooja, Joanna, and Shamin for being here today.
Okay. Thank you. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. See you.